I want to thank Dick Jeffries for inviting me to speak with you and Bill McCarroll for setting up the Zoom presentation. To get us in the Air Force aviation mood, I'd like to start by reading a short passage. It's October 1978, and I'm in the advanced portion of pilot training in my T-38 at the end of my night solo mission. After I completed an uneventful navigation leg around the city of Lubbock, I returned to Reese Air Force Base to do practice landings before calling it a night. As I approached the airfield, I requested authorization to fly an overhead pattern to a touch and go landing. The first aircraft to return to base that night, I passed above the takeoff end of the runway going 300 miles per hour. I pulled the throttles back to idle power and made a hard 180-degree right turn to set myself up on the downwind leg. Reducing my speed, configuring my aircraft for landing, and getting enough displacement from the runway so that when I made my final 180-degree turn toward the runway, I would roll out on final approach, lined up to land the aircraft. Easy. I had done this hundreds of times already, even at night. Except things were not what they seemed. No one knew about the severe wind shear between the wind at traffic pattern altitude, 1,500 feet in the air, and the wind reported at ground level. On the ground, the wind went straight down the runway. At altitude, a 50-mile-an-hour crosswind pushed me closer to the airfield while I flew my downwind leg. This meant my displacement from the runway became smaller and smaller as I set myself up for my final turn for landing. It also meant the 50-mile-an-hour crosswind would quickly become a tailwind as I made my turn, and I would lose 1/3 of my airspeed in seconds. Since I hadn't flown a night approach on this runway, I didn't have any downwind ground references. The lighted electrical shack and the road intersection I had been using as visual checkpoints were useless. Still, I had general guidelines for where I should place myself, and I used those. Those guidelines, though, didn't account for strong crosswinds. As I reached my 30-second timing point past the end of the runway, I felt confident. I put down my landing gear and banked hard to the right. I turned my head around to pick up my aim point as I descended rapidly. The aim point is a spot on the runway that pilots use to make a safe landing. It's not marked on the runway. Instead, each pilot must determine his or her aim point depending on the type of plane they're flying, the weather, the condition and length of the runway, and a host of other things. Seconds ticked by. Finally, about halfway around the turn, I saw my aim point on the runway. I instantly knew things were terribly wrong. I was way too low. Worse than that, I realized my bank angle was far too steep. I quickly focused on my angle of attack indicator on top of the instrument panel. It was glowing bright red. My stalled out wings were no longer providing the lift I needed to stay airborne. I knew I was in a desperate situation. I immediately threw my throttles into full afterburner and raised my landing gear to reduce drag. Because I had started my turn much too close to the runway, I had unknowingly maneuvered too aggressively, attempting to make things look right for the landing. I cross-checked my vertical velocity indicator and I saw it pegged at 4,000 feet per minute going down. My altimeter showed me plummeting through 1,000 feet above the ground. I wasn't flying anymore. I was falling out of the sky. It would only be a matter of seconds before I hit the ground at over 100 miles per hour and exploded in a fireball. My heart was in my throat. I carefully leveled the wings to increase lift. I needed to allow the plane to continue its descent to regain speed. If I tried to pull back on the stick too soon, I would lose what little lift I still had, and I would go deeper and deeper into the stall and crash. As I sank into the unlit darkness of the field leading to the runway, I saw the runway lights get flatter and flatter. I had to remain disciplined and continue my descent at full power, just to give the plane time to accelerate to minimum climb speed. At one point, I noticed the lights at the far end of the airfield weren't visible anymore because the small rise midway down the runway blocked them. The airfield was on a slight plateau, and I was going below runway altitude. I knew I could hit the ground at any second. What I just read was an excerpt from chapter 1 of my book. For the vast majority of you who have not read my book, I will not tell you how things turned out. You'll have to wait to find out if I crash and die that night or not. Almost all of us at this meeting are Air Force veterans, and many of us made the Air Force a career. What we all share in common, though, is that we all had first assignments. These initial assignments almost always made the difference between an airman leaving the Air Force after 1 or 2 tours and an airman staying for a career. When I was commissioned in 1977, I did not intend to make the Air Force a career. I was going to do the best I could, and after fulfilling my active duty service commitment, I was going to fly for the airlines, just like my father had done. By the end of my second operational assignment, I had changed my mind, and I was committed to the Air Force, where I retired after 30 years of service. Tonight, I'd like to talk about my first assignments, as shown on this slide, and why they had such a positive impact on me. Here's a graphic depiction of where I was stationed during my career. As you can see, I was mostly in the South, Southwest, and Midwest, with a couple of tours in Europe. I'm also certain that many of you can relate to each of these assignments. The first assignments I'm going to discuss have a green pin associated with them, although I'm happy to talk about any assignments, locations, or anything else after the presentation. All of us who became officers went through training at the Air Force Academy, Officer Training School, or Air Force ROTC. I chose to apply to the University of California because I wanted to go to a prestigious school that had both Air Force and Navy ROTC. I also needed to go to a state-sponsored school in case I didn't get awarded an ROTC scholarship and needed to pay for everything myself. What I discovered was that being an ROTC cadet with a cadet haircut and occasionally wearing an Air Force uniform was a decidedly out-of-step stance to take in the mid-1970s in Berkeley. While outright hostility happened, it was rare. For the most part, students at Cal were very indifferent to us. Being a cadet was not the way to become popular. As a result, my fellow cadets and I bonded over our shared experiences. We became very good friends and remain so to this day, gathering every other year to renew our friendships. Also, the wonderful ROTC faculty at Cal became mentors to all of us too. In the end, with the support of my friends and the ROTC faculty, I graduated from Cal with a positive attitude about the Air Force and what it represented. I was eager for what came next. I know there are many of you who went through UPT and have amazing stories to tell. Pilot training is a transformative experience for student pilots. It is very tough and demanding. In the end, though, it instills self-confidence to all who graduate. My experience at pilot training, to paraphrase Charles Dickens, was the best of times and the worst of times. I'm sure there are many of you who took to flight training like ducks to water and had little trouble excelling through the one-year course. I had classmates like you. They typically graduated from an aviation-oriented school like Embry-Riddle or Parks College. I was not one of those pilots. Pilot training was a struggle for me at the beginning. In particular, the ability to prioritize specific tasks in the cockpit escaped me for the longest time. At one point, I came very close to washing out. Then, as if by magic, the light bulb came on near the end of T-37s. Everything came together. From that point on, I excelled. Like every success I've had in life, I've had help. In T-38s, I had the great fortune of being assigned to a brand new instructor. His name was Captain Chuck Hanner, and he was on a career broadening tour after flying the F-106 for years. I was his first student. Captain Hanner drove me hard. We flew 2 or 3 demanding missions a day. It was challenging to keep up, but he also provided me some intense, personalized instruction, and I thrived. By the end of pilot training, I was in the top third of my class. I had earned both of the highly coveted qualifications of fighter qualified and instructor qualified. Both the T-37 instructors and T-38 instructors at Reese even wanted me to come back and join them. I was set up for a premier assignment. What I did next can only be described as shooting myself in the foot. Because what I really wanted to do was learn how to fly transports and travel the world, I made a point of writing that on my dream sheet. I even went so far as to say that I'd really like to be assigned to Travis Air Force Base so I could be close to where I grew up. I might as well have held up a sign that said, "This guy is going to get out, send him someplace cold and remote and strategic air command." So when assignments night came and we all found out where we were headed after UPT, I discovered that I was going to K.I. Sawyer Air Force Base in Upper Michigan to fly the KC-135. I was shocked. I was upset. This was not what I wanted at all. I decided that for sure I'll go and do my very best, but I was going to only stay in the Air Force for one tour, and that was it. In 1979, when I joined Strategic Air Command, is one of the two big dogs in the Air Force, the other being Tactical Air Command, who often spoke for the regionally oriented commands like USAFE or PACAF. There were other commands, of course, like MAC, Training Command, and Materiel Command, but SAC and TAC carried the most weight by far. SAC was a major presence on over 30 bases in the US. The two workhorse aircraft in SAC were the B-52 bomber and the KC-135 tanker. SAC's primary role was nuclear deterrence, with typically 1/3 of a bomb wing's aircraft on 24/7 nuclear alert every minute of every day. In 1979, the shadow of Curtis LeMay still loomed very large over SAC. One of the first things my instructor crew at Castle Air Force Base told me after I arrived for KC-135 training was that while the SAC motto was "Peace is our profession," the unofficial SAC motto was "Your reward for doing well is the absence of punishment." So even before I showed up at K.I. Sawyer, the seed was planted that I was in for a miserable time. In 1979, the KC-135A model was the primary Air Force tanker. Typically, a KC-135 squadron was paired with a B-52 squadron, which formed the core of a SAC bomb wing. The KC-135 had a 4-person crew, as shown here. The crew components stayed this way from the time the KC-135 came online in the mid-50s up until the glass cockpit avionics modification in the 90s. At that point, the navigator's position was removed, except when flying certain sensitive or special operations missions. The 135 airframe was present throughout the Air Force, including as a reconnaissance RC-135 and the command post EC-135. Over 700 135 airframes were delivered to the Air Force, and they're still the backbone of the tanker fleet today. The crews that flew the KC-135 loved it, and that included me. It was reliable, capable, flew in all types of weather, and it had nice, clean lines. The only downside was the engines. The J-57 engines were state-of-the-art technology in the 1950s, but they were seriously underpowered. To take off with a full fuel load, it used every bit of the 2.5-mile-long SAC runways. Even then, it needed water injection, which was a 3-minute injection of demineralized water into the front of the engine during takeoff. This made the air denser and increased the engine's thrust by 33%. It also was the source of the KC-135 nickname, the steam jet, because of the large volume of smoke that poured out of the back end of the aircraft when we had a water takeoff. When we conducted heavyweight takeoffs, especially during the hot summer, when engine performance dropped dramatically, it was always a white knuckle event. Starting in the mid-1980s, the J-57 engines on the A model were replaced by the 3 times more powerful CFM56 engines on the R model. This was a huge improvement in so many ways. K.I. Sawyer, along with the 4 bases listed here, had the infamous designation of being Northern Tier bases. This meant that even SAC realized that being stationed at one of these bases was an extraordinary hardship. Being a Northern Tier base meant that SAC promised to reassign crew members to one of their top choices at the end of 3 years. In reality, people were so ready to move someplace warm that they typically took whatever was offered. The primary reasons KI Sawyer was a Northern Tier base was that it was freezing, except for a few weeks in the summer. The weather was extreme, often with 200 inches of snow a year, and the base was in a very remote location. The nearest town was Marquette, population 20,000, which revolved around the small University of Northern Michigan and the iron mining industry. It didn't have much to offer. The next closest city of any size was Green Bay, Wisconsin, and that was 3 hours away. We used to go there for a wild time on long weekends. Yes, we were that desperate. There was hunting and fishing for those who enjoyed those activities, but being a kid who grew up in the Bay Area suburbs, that was lost on me. When we weren't trying to find something fun to do, we pulled alert, a lot of alert. A typical crew member was on alert 1/3 of the time. After 1 week of alert, we'd get a 4-day weekend, which was nice. Then we'd do our flying training for the next 10 days, and then we'd find ourselves back on alert again, and there would be no more flying for 11 days. Those who pulled alert know it was something of a Groundhog Day experience. We slept on bunk beds, 3 or 4 to a room, guys snored, the bathrooms always had a line in the morning. We couldn't leave the alert facility except to go to a small number of approved locations with the rest of our crew. The entire experience was mind-numbing. The worst day of the month was the day we started our alert tour and realized that we had 7 more days of this. We knew exactly what to expect. Making things even worse were some external influences. The one thing we all loved was flying, but between the post-Vietnam budget cuts, the 1979 Iranian fuel crisis, and the air traffic controller strike, we weren't even doing much of that. Our flying hours were cut to the bone. Finally, from a tanker crew member perspective, there was one other problem. The bomber crews were seen as being the first team by many people in wing leadership and even by the bomber crew members themselves. This meant that we tanker officers often got lower endorsements on our officer evaluations, fewer chances for choice assignments after KI Sawyer, and promotion rates weren't as high for us. Altogether, the environment was not encouraging for a young single tanker lieutenant. Despite some of the ominous signs, I certainly began my assignment with a good attitude. I wanted to be the best tanker pilot and best officer I could be, no question. Still, I started my tour with the goal of finishing my assignment successfully and then moving on to something else, whether that was flying in the Air Force or flying as a civilian. What I found was that I loved what I was doing. I loved being a tanker pilot. I loved being an Air Force officer, and I loved the people I worked with in the Air Force. I even finished my 3-year tour at KI Sawyer as the youngest aircraft commander in the squadron. So what happened? In a nutshell, I had the great fortune and good judgment to seek out some outstanding officers like Captain Jim Poland, Captain Rick Fitzhugh, and Captain Buck Marr for advice and mentoring. They were career-oriented, had great attitudes, and were open to helping a young lieutenant co-pilot. I also made some amazing friends who were my age and rank. This was really important as we hung out together and socialized with each other. This was critical in a place like KI Sawyer where we needed to make friends with who we worked with. There really wasn't any other alternative. In the end, I felt like I had one of the most positive experiences of my life, especially since it led to a fantastic opportunity. I was going to the KC-10. In 1982, the KC-10 extender was just starting to be built. The Pentagon realized post-Vietnam there simply wasn't enough tanker or cargo capability in the Air Force. The ATCA competition between the Boeing 747 and the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 resulted in the KC-10 program. As a modified long-range version of the DC-10, the KC-10 could significantly increase both tanker and cargo capabilities. The production run of 60 aircraft would go on for 10 years. This wasn't nearly as many airframes as the KC-135 program, but it was still a major improvement for the Air Force. The KC-10 had 4 crew members, with a flight engineer taking the place of the navigator. In addition to being able to carry far more fuel, the biggest capability improvement was the CFM6 turbofan engines. Each KC-10 engine could provide more than 5 times the thrust of a KC-135 engine. The KC-10 also had capabilities that the KC-135 didn't have. In addition to being designed specifically for carrying cargo, it also could receive fuel. This meant the KC-10 could launch with receiver aircraft, typically fighters, and with transoceanic refueling, it could escort the fighters all the way to their destination across the Pacific or Atlantic Oceans, along with carrying their support cargo and personnel. This was a huge capability improvement. It meant that tankers and receivers didn't need to stop on island bases in mid-ocean. The home base environment was night and day as well when compared to my previous unit. While K.I. Sawyer was hastily constructed in the massive SAC expansion of the 1950s, March was one of the beautiful, historic, original Army Air Corps bases from the 1920s. March was losing their outdated B-52D mission, and the KC-10s were taking their ramp space and facilities. We would now be the 22nd Air Refueling Wing. It was not a bomb wing anymore. This was a huge positive change for us as tanker crews. The funding environment changed dramatically as well. This was the beginning of the Reagan buildup, which led to an era where funding for operations and equipment was more plentiful. We also had the opportunity to start up a new tanker squadron. Along with the 32nd ARS at Barksdale, the 9th was the first new air refueling squadron in decades. It was an exhilarating experience to be on the ground floor of that. And perhaps most important, the KC-10 didn't pull alert. For old tanker crew members, this was a major quality of life improvement. Additionally, we were in Southern California. We were no longer isolated, and we didn't have to chip ice off our cars from October through April. All of what I described about the aircraft, the new mission, and the living environment was very important, of course. Perhaps the most important piece of this whole puzzle was who I worked with in the squadron. Everyone in the entire KC-10 program was handpicked by a selection board at SAC. The KC-10 crew members I flew with were the most extraordinary, talented, and motivated group of aviators I ever experienced during my career. This was true throughout the entire squadron. No one was bringing up the rear. The KC-10 missions took me all over the world, to the Pacific, to Europe, and to the Middle East. I was in heaven. One time, I got in trouble with my squadron commander because I wasn't taking vacation and was going to lose several weeks of leave. He told me I was making him look bad because the wing commander assumed that my squadron commander was working me so hard that he wasn't letting me go on leave. The truth was that I was having so much fun that I wasn't even thinking about vacation. I didn't want to miss anything happening in the squadron by going on leave. The end result was that with the wonderful mission I was flying and the amazing people I worked with, it was easy to see a very bright future ahead. I never looked back. So this slide is a call to action. As Air Force Association members, we can do so much to encourage and mentor younger Air Force members or prospective Air Force recruits. We can all reach out in different ways, some of which may not be readily obvious. For example, we as a chapter have a close relationship with the San Diego State ROTC detachment and junior ROTC detachments in the area. This is fantastic, and so much credit goes to all of you, and especially chapter leaders like Dick Jeffries. We can do other things for them as well. After our November AFA chapter meeting, I reached out to Colonel Grimm, the commander of ROTC Detachment 75. I offered to contribute in whatever way I could. He took me up on my offer and asked me to address his 40 sophomore cadets who are preparing to go to field training this summer. As a result, I created a tailored briefing for them that focused on 5 lessons I learned from my field training years ago. The briefing went over very well, and it was followed by a lively question and answer session with the cadets. The detachment invited me to come back next year to give the same briefing to the next class. The reason I bring this up is that all of us have so much wisdom to impart to these cadets and other civic groups about what we do in the Air Force. I encourage you to look for opportunities to do just that. The last thing I want to touch on is the importance of writing our own stories, however we may choose to do that. There are so many reasons for this. First and foremost, every one of us has a fascinating story to tell. It's just waiting to come out. I encourage each of you to do just that for yourself, for your children and grandchildren, your friends, and even for people you haven't met yet. They will be thrilled that you gave them this wonderful gift. As Dick mentioned earlier, not only have I written and published a book about my experiences, I have also created a series of writing retreats that help veterans and others write their books. I can help guide you through the retreat process. I can also provide one-on-one coaching and encouragement towards editing and publishing your book. Whichever way you choose, whether you write your book on your own or are aided by me or someone else, I strongly encourage you to get started. It's one of those things that can easily get kicked to the bottom of your to-do list and just stay there. And as an example of what can be accomplished, one of my first author clients, Bob Hendrickson, is getting ready to publish his incredible book. Bob is a friend of mine from our KC-10 days. After leaving the Air Force, he became a TWA airline pilot and then one of the FAA's accident investigation supervisors. For the last 10 years, he has also been suffering with Parkinson's disease. After months of work between the two of us, his book will be out in less than a month. That's his book cover on the bottom left. I want to thank you all for your time and attention. And if there are any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. And here's my contact info if you'd like to make contact with me.
Yes, sir. I had a question for you.
Sure.
How was that 135 when you put those TF-33s on it? Did you apply with the TF-33s on that 135?
So that's the E model KC-135,
Yeah.
I believe. Yeah, that was what the reserve and the guard flew.
Yeah.
And that was more capable than the A model.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it was not nearly as capable as the R model. And later on down the line, most of the guard and reserve units, I think, went to they either retired the models or they went to, they modified them to our models. And what happened, I mean, I'm going to go on this, but what happened was that those E models with the 33 engines were former airliners typically. So there was some extra modifications that they would have to make. And typically they just retired those as well. They didn't modify many of them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. I remember Pan Am had a whole fleet of those 707s.
Yeah.
They were like, anytime I saw Pan Am, it was a 707. I remember that model. I came in 71 and I remember those hauling troops back in Vietnam, Marines.
You bet. And just to follow up on good question, George, thank you. And just to follow up on what George said, for those who may not know, the 135 was based on the 707. It is a military version of the 707 modified for tankers. So it was, if you flew on a 707, it was very similar to a KC-135, but it wasn't militarized and no refueling, obviously. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Perfect. Thank you very much, guys.
Bruce, thanks for your presentation. A lot of interesting information in there. Hopefully when we can get together face to face, you'll be able to make it to some of the meetings because I can add some information in a lot of different areas for you. The the KC-10 program, KI Sawyer, a lot of different things there that we might want to compare notes on. So interesting. Wish you the best of luck in your writing program, and hopefully somebody will or some people will take you up on on doing that. Because you're right, there's a tremendous number of stories out there that need to be told. You know, normally we would give our presenter a coin. So I will send you a coin. We would normally give you a 1-year subscription to the Air Force Association, a 1-year membership. But you're a life member, so I don't know. I'll send you a certificate or something you can put in the pyramid with you, and you can continue it on through your afterlife there. But great to have you in the chapter. We're up to about 650 people or so now. It's come back up a little bit, and it's great to hear presentations like yours. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. And if you want to get a hold of me, if you didn't catch, I know the last slide flew up there for a minute or so, but Dick has my info and Bill has my info as well. So it's easy, and I'll be around. So like Dick said, hopefully the next meeting we'll be in person and we'll have a chance to talk. But thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, Larry, looks like you wanted to say something. You're on mute. You're still on mute. Okay.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can.
Yeah. You're familiar probably with March Field Museum.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that would be a great starting point, or one of the areas to promote your book. They have a gift shop there, and I think they would love your book.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good suggestion. And in fact, I launched my book just before COVID hit. So yeah, that was bad timing. But now that we're going to open up hopefully soon, that's one of the places I want to visit. And I mentioned in the briefing that I was at March when we opened the squadron. I came back to March. It was the only place I came back to a second time. And I was a squadron commander, a KC-10 squadron commander, when we closed the squadron at March, and it transferred up to Travis. So I've seen it both opening and closing. And that would be a good place to, talk to whomever and promote my book or book writing or what have you. Good suggestion. Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, you're welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Bruce, what year were you there at March the second time?
1994, 95.
Okay.
Yeah,
Is
that's
your book readily available, like on Amazon? Where do we get it?
It's on Amazon. It's hardcover, paperback, and I recorded an Audible version. I'm the narrator in an Audible version. So if you don't want to read, but you want to listen, it's available too, and it's on Amazon.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Dee.
Hey, Bruce, I have a question. Dave Barnett here. I flew the old F-100, so I refueled behind that KC-135 many times. It was really a really great experience, so I appreciate your briefing. Would you share your email address one more time?
Sure. The easiest way to get a hold of me is my business address. Right? Actually, it's Colonel Bruce Hurd. It's COLBRUCEHURD@gmail.com. So once again, I'm going to put it in the chat here, but it's COLBRUCEHURD@gmail.com. Thank you. Thanks for asking, Dave.
Colonel, what did you do in Monterey?
What's that?
What did you do in Monterey?
I had 2 assignments in Europe. One was in Germany, and then I got a follow-on assignment to work at the ODC in Brussels, Belgium, the Office of Defense Cooperation at the embassy. And they sent me from Germany to Monterey to go to the Defense Language School to learn French. And so I spent a year learning French in Monterey, and I went back to Europe. And when I was at the Defense Language Institute, I outranked everybody at the school, including the school commander. And there I was, a French student, and the pressure was on because I could not fail. I did not want to fail.
Bruce, another thought in terms of your book is the museum that's over in Palm Springs.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they're their place over there, and you know, maybe you could get something going with them.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dick.
Yep. You're welcome.